welcome back to Still Horse History Adventures. Sorry it's taking a little while to get this video out. If you take time to watch the other video I'm going to post around the same time, you'll figure out kind of what happened. Let's just say life got really crazy really quickly for me. I'm still recovering from that, but I decided since I had a day off, I would just drive down here and finish up this Robert Smalls video that I had promised to do the part 2 to. So finally I found the ability to do it. I can get back out to my place. I can edit this video and get it out to you guys. With that said, there was other videos I had planned for the month of February. I am going to slowly work on getting those out. You know, just because they were planned for February doesn't mean that they're not still able to be done now that it's no longer February. So we're out here for today, of course, is the continuation of the Robert Smalls story. In the first video, of course, I went through the general history of his life, showed you where he had purchased a house at, showed you his burial spot. In this video, I'm going to focus a lot more just on his Civil War history, how he goes from being a slave on a ship in the Confederacy over to being a pilot as a freedman in the Union Navy, well, as a civilian pilot for the Union Navy, and then later on a few other Civil War exploits that he'll do before the Civil War actually ends, and we get more into his political career as we kind of did in the previous video. Now, the first story that we're going to start off with is honestly him as a Confederate. Robert Smalls himself, of course, was just a slave into the Confederacy. As we had discussed in the previous video, he arrived here in Charleston at 12 years old to begin working on the ships. He was a slave for hire, sending money back to the McKee family for any bit of money that he would earn here. He had managed to raise a little bit of money, as Mr. McKee did allow him to keep very small portions of that money. And he was hoping to one day buy his freedom for him, his wife Hannah, and their children. Now, the American Civil War, of course, begins on April 12th, 1861 with the Battle of Fort Sumter. If you look over my shoulder, you may be able to see in the far distance there, Fort Sumter. But Robert Smalls, in about June or so of that year, take that back, actually in the fall of that year, I almost got ahead of myself in the story. So in fall of 1861, he is made the pilot, without the official title, of course, of the ship, the CSS Planter. He was under the command of several white Confederate officers, to include Captain Relia. So at first, his service under the Confederate side, his officers would have believed that he was quite content in the job that he was doing. Mainly what his job was on the CSS Planter was to be able to transmit messages along all the Confederate posts, resupply them with ammunition, resupply them with men, and of course from time to time transport guns along. You would also find small ships such as his being a scout ship through the waterways, looking for any Union disturbances. Maybe they had set traps, things of that nature. They were also used to set traps themselves, such as mines, or what they would have called torpedoes at that time. So he was out setting many of the mines in the waterways nearby Charleston. Now we get around to about April of 1862, and Robert Smalls begins planning an escape. As he goes to plan this escape, he knows that he can't just simply steal the CSS Planter and sail right out of Charleston's harbor. The ship makes too much steam. There's smoke coming out of the stack, and honestly it just makes way too much noise. The Confederates are going to hear him slipping by, so he's going to have to find a way to make them believe that he's supposed to be leaving the harbor. Now, one of the easiest ways for him to do that is, of course, to act like he's on a routine mission, and that's where his plan begins. He needs to figure out how to get past the guards here by the port. He needs to figure out how to appear as if the officers are on board, and he needs to, most importantly, figure out a way to get past Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter blocks the mouth of Charleston's harbor even today, and if you're looking at that time period in American history, with the fortifications on Fort Sumter, it would have been very, very difficult to just slip right on by. So he believes that sometime in either late April or the very, very beginning of May of 1862, Robert Smalls let his crew in on his plan. They claim that he told every member of the crew, minus one, who he did not trust. Apparently there was one of the slaves on the crew that he felt would spoil their plans and would actually give away the secrets. So they made these plans, they informed their families of it, and then on May 12th of 1862, they are going out into the Stono River and they are disassembling one of the Confederate outposts that are out there. They're loading up all the guns, and they have a plan that evening what they're going to do is delay. They're going to take more time to unload these guns than what is necessary. That would create the ability for them to leave the boat here at the harbor. Now, as routine was, the Confederate officers, anytime they were in harbor and parked for the night, they would leave the boat in the hands of Robert Smalls and his men. Those men would guard the boat while the Confederate officers would spend an evening among the town, and of course maybe even going home. So they kind of waste a little time doing this. Evening starts closing in, and the Confederate officers decide to retire for the evening. As was customary for them, they leave the boat with Robert Smalls and his men, and they also allowed for the families of these crew members to come and visit them as long as they were home by curfew. So the families come in, they let them know the final plans, tell them where they need to be waiting for them at, and ultimately they are going to pretend to escort them back home. Now, it is claimed at this point that when Robert Smalls had told Hannah the plan, letting her know the full details of it, that he did not hold back. He told her that if they were caught, they would surely be shot. Now, Hannah's response was something to the effect of, "It is a risk, my dear, but you and I and our little ones must be free. Where you go, I will go, for where you die, so shall I." Now, that's not a direct quote from her, but it is very close to what she would have said. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit for it. So Robert Smalls and his men, of course, pretend to escort them back to their homes for the evening, but realistically they have them dodge into one of the local wharfs. Now, it actually is near this spot here behind me where the CSS Planter was parked that night, and once the families had been let in, had been taken up to a wharf to wait for the CSS Planter, Robert Smalls and his men began preparations. Of course, there's a fog coming in on the ocean at the time. They're waiting for the fog to thin down. If they try to escape in the middle of the fog, it would look unusual. So as this fog is dying down, Robert Smalls finally gives the order for the little steamboat, of course, to depart. Now, one of the things that he has done to pretend as if the officers are on board is he's actually taken the straw hat of Captain Relia. Captain Relia was known for wearing this hat, and many men who would have known the CSS Planter would have known that about him. So in order to escape with it looking as if the captain was on board, he must have that hat. He has managed to get it. As they board the ship, the Planter, they turn up the Cooper River and then go and pick up their families. In total, they're going to have to pass by 8 Confederate checkpoints, and as they are actually boarding the ship itself, a Confederate guard sees the ship, the Planter, departing from its spot here behind me, but assumes that the officers must be on board. Now, we would have found that Confederates at that time, and many men around the country, not just Confederates, would have believed that slaves were not capable of such a complex plan. So they wouldn't have felt that these slaves were actually stealing the ship, the Planter. They felt they must have been commanded to move it, or the officers would have been on board, right? So they just made the assumptions the officers are there. There's actually an officer of the police who sees them as well and assumes the same thing. So luck is really on their side at the moment. And they're going to appear, to begin with, to get away with this. Both men, or all the men on board, of course, are very nervous about it. One of the reports is that the men were shaking with fear, with the exception of Robert Smalls, who kept his calm. But ultimately they end up by where the present day aquarium is, what was once known as like Gadsden's Wharf, up by the North Atlantic Wharf. That is where their families are hiding out for them, and they are going to go up there and have them board on. As they pass back down the Cooper River, they begin approaching Fort Sumter, and as they go to pass Fort Sumter, Robert Smalls lets out the whistle signal that was appropriate for that time period. If I'm not mistaken, it was 2 long blows followed by 1 short blow. So one of the Confederate men on Fort Sumter supposedly yelled out to go take out those Yankees or bring one back. Now, Robert Smalls, of course, could have had many responses for this, but according to reports, he yelled out, "Aye, aye." Now, as they depart our harbor here, they turn south. They're bound for Port Royal, South Carolina. They're heading to the nearest Union blockade ships. There is a Union blockade ship known as the Onward that is nearby, and Robert Smalls makes a direct beeline for it. Now, as the fog is breaking, they are worried that they have, since they have taken down the Confederate flag and the South Carolina flag from the ship and replaced it with a white sheet, that maybe due to the fog, the white sheet would not be visible, and the onward would assume that they're just going to be a Confederate boat attempting to ram them. But as they draw near, it becomes quite obvious that the white sheet has been seen, the order to not fire has been given, and then a captain, well, acting captain, an actual lieutenant on the ship, starts issuing out orders to Robert Smalls and his men to identify themselves, in which Robert Smalls will of course address that he is the planter. They are escaped slaves, and they have brought the ship to Union lines to turn over to the Union forces. With that, they have brought them some of the old United States guns, as he will call them, but realistically those were the Confederate guns that had come from the fort they had torn down off the Stono River. They hand that all over to the Union. Robert Smalls and his men were rewarded quite handsomely. The prize money that they got for the ship, the Planter, or at least Robert Smalls' share of it, would be about $1,500, or what would equate in around our time frame to about $40,000. Now that's quite a bit for a slave or a former slave to have ended up with. At this point, of course, he's going to be awarded his freedom. He becomes a freedman, and he begins to do his service for the Union Navy. One of the things he's also going to do is be a military advisor to the Union concerning the defenses of Charleston, as he is well versed in those defenses, many of which he helped place himself. Now, once Robert Smalls officially enters into Union service as a civilian pilot, he is placed as the pilot of a ship known as the Crusader under Captain Alexander Rhind. Now, Captain Rhind, of course, will be the overall commander of the ship, but for the most part, Robert Smalls is really going to give him a lot of advice, because their orders are to come here near Charleston and to start going and finding many of those mines that had previously been laid. Now, Alexander Rhind doesn't have a big idea of where these are, but Robert Smalls does. So he's going to heavily rely on Robert Smalls' expertise in the defenses of this area. Robert Smalls will continue helping remove these mines, also providing some assistance to other troops and stuff along the islands. But ultimately, several months later, this former CSS Planter comes back into service, and Robert Smalls will be able to pilot it as well. He'll remain on both the Crusader and the Planter whenever it is needed. The Planter was favored as the hull of it was a little shallower than many of the small ships. You can kind of get through the marshlands here honestly a little easier than maybe some of the larger ships could have done. So it would depend on what the mission was, whether or not they were going to use the Crusader or they were going to end up using the Planter. He would actually be there the day that the Planter would be fired on by Confederate forces down near Adams Run along the river. He would witness many of the small battles that would happen here. In total, in his military service, I believe, according to his own account, he was present for 17 battles. Now, in early 1863, Robert Smalls will be transferred over to the USS Keokuk. It's an ironclad, and Alexander Rhind, the captain, of course, will be sent over to that as well. I would be willing to bet that Captain Rhind was the one who insisted that Robert Smalls come with him to the Keokuk. Now, they were going to participate in an assault on April 7th of 1863 that will become the preamble to the Second Battle of Fort Sumter. In the course of that assault, the Keokuk, I believe, will take 96 hits before it retires for the evening and sinks sometime early the next morning. Robert Smalls and his men, the rest of the crew members of the Keokuk, will return to the Ironside, and they will rejoin the fleet at Hilton Head. Now, in June of 1863, just about a year into his military service with the Union Navy, Robert Smalls will be placed as the pilot of a ship called the Uss Isaac Smith. Now, this ship, of course, is going to end up inevitably being captured by the Confederacy and commissioned to the Confederate Navy as the Stono. It happened somewhere around Morris Island. Of course, Morris Island, most famous for being where the 54th Massachusetts will do their famous assault on Fort Wagner. That is a whole different video all of its own, but stay tuned for that when I eventually do cover the 54th Massachusetts. So just know this event happens pretty close by. Now, by December of 1863, Robert Smalls has returned to the ship the Planter under Union service, and Captain Nickerson is the captain of the ship at that time. On December 1st of 1863, they passed by the batteries by Secessionville, which I actually did a little bit of a video on the Battle of Secessionville previously, if you want to look that up on the channel. One of the batteries near Secessionville will fire upon the CSS Planter, well, the USS Planter at this point, and Captain Nickerson is said to have ran from the pilot house in fear. He was ready to surrender, but Robert Smalls, fearing that black crewmen would not be treated as prisoners of war and would rather be killed, decided that he was not going to surrender. He ends up maneuvering the ship the Planter himself without any command from Captain Nickerson. Now, when word reaches General Gilmore that this has happened, General Gilmore is said to have actually promoted Robert Smalls to acting captain of the ship the Planter. Robert Smalls will continue using the ship the Planter under Union command until about May of 1864, at which point he's going to be appointed an unofficial delegate to the Republican National Convention in Baltimore. He will also later that year take the USS Planter up to Philadelphia for refurbishment. While he's there in Philadelphia, I had mentioned in the previous video about him that he had learned to read and write while in Philadelphia. All right. Now, this is going to be important because it's going to create, of course, that preamble to his political career. If he was not able to read and write, he wouldn't have been able to serve in the Black Congress and the House of Representatives. He wouldn't have been able to serve as the collector of customs down in Beaufort afterwards. So it was important, this trip to Philadelphia. While he was there, though, he did encounter a couple of things that would have quite upset him. Using the tram system in Philadelphia, he had been asked to remove himself from the tram or to sit toward the back. There was standing room that was reserved for people of African descent. Now, instead of doing that, instead of being embarrassed further, Robert Smalls and his white counterpart that was with him removed themselves from the tram completely. So he did have some unfortunate events happen while up north. A lot of times people believe that once they got up north they were treated completely fairly, and that's just simply not the case. America as a whole at that time was still quite racist, regardless of whether or not somebody agreed with slavery or not. Now, Robert Smalls will continue to serve in the Union honorably. He will even be present in Savannah when Sherman's forces arrive in Savannah for that ending of the final, march to the sea that he does. Later on, after the American Civil War is officially over, the Planter will be back here in Charleston for the returning of the flag, or the American flag, to Fort Sumter. So all in all, that pretty much sums up Robert Smalls's major highlights in Civil War service, from the time that he went from the Confederacy all the way into his service in the Union. And of course, his service in the Union and the viewpoint of him being a war hero is going to help him establish his political career for the remainder of his life. Again, Robert Smalls passes away in 1915. And again, as I always say, in my opinion, he is one of the most inspirational men to come out of the American Civil War. Thank you for joining me for the video. Make sure you guys are hitting the like and the subscribe button. Tell your friends about this channel. Spread word for it. We're doing pretty good, but of course I still need to get tons of followers to get to that magic 1,000 mark to be able to monetize for YouTube and get paid to do this content. I'm not looking to get wealthy off of it, but hey, it'd be nice if YouTube paid for my vacations, right? So as always, make sure you guys take care of each other and check twice and save a life. Until next time, have a good one.